The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window of our modest two-story home in suburban Columbus, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor where I stood washing dishes from lunch. The warm water ran over my hands as I scrubbed the same plate for the third time, my mind elsewhere, lost in the comfortable routine of a Tuesday in late September. The scent of the apple cinnamon candles Sarah had given me last Christmas still lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of coffee grounds from this morning's pot. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking intermittently through the thin walls, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed its mechanical tune. At 68 years old, I had settled into the rhythm of retirement life. My husband Robert had passed away 3 years ago, leaving me with this house we had shared for 32 years, along with memories embedded in every creaky floorboard and faded photograph on the mantelpiece. The house felt too big for just me now, with its 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, but it was home. The mortgage had been paid off for over a decade, and the property taxes were manageable on my Social Security and Robert's pension. I had no intention of moving. My daughter Sarah lived just 20 minutes away with her husband Marcus and their twin boys, 8-year-old Jake and Tommy. Sarah worked as a dental hygienist at a practice downtown, while Marcus managed a small auto repair shop that had been struggling since the pandemic. They visited every other Sunday for dinner, a tradition we had maintained since Robert's funeral. Sarah would bring her famous cornbread, and I would make pot roast with all the fixings. The boys would run through the house like tiny tornadoes, their laughter echoing off the walls and bringing life back to rooms that had grown too quiet. My son David, 2 years younger than Sarah, lived in Phoenix with his wife Jennifer and their teenage daughter Emma. David worked in tech support for a large corporation, and while his salary was decent, the cost of living in Arizona had been climbing steadily. He called me every Wednesday evening, and we would talk for an hour about everything and nothing. His visits were less frequent, maybe twice a year, but when he came, he would spend the entire weekend fixing things around the house that I had been meaning to address. The leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, the loose handrail on the front porch, the squeaky hinges on the garden gate. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted my thoughts, and I looked up to see Sarah's silver Honda Civic pulling up beside the house. This was unusual. It was Tuesday, not Sunday, and she typically called before dropping by unexpectedly. I dried my hands on the dish towel, noting how the fabric had become threadbare after years of use, and walked to the front door. Sarah stepped out of her car, and I immediately noticed something different about her demeanor. Her usually bright smile seemed forced, and there was a tension in her shoulders that reminded me of how she used to look as a teenager when she had broken curfew or failed a test she had not told me about. She wore her blue scrubs from work, and her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, several strands having escaped to frame her face. She carried a manila envelope in her left hand, clutching it against her chest as if it contained something precious or dangerous. The October air carried a crisp bite that hinted at the coming winter, and I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders as I stepped onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under my feet, a sound that had become as familiar as my own breathing over the decades. Sarah approached slowly, her footsteps deliberate and careful on the cracked concrete walkway that Robert had always meant to repair but never quite got around to. "Hello, Mom," she said, her voice carrying an odd formality that made my stomach tighten with unease. I wondered if something had happened at work, or if there was trouble between her and Marcus again. They had gone through a rough patch 2 years ago when his business was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the stress had put a strain on their marriage that took months to heal. "Hello, sweetheart," I replied, studying her face for clues. "You are home early today. Is everything all right at the office?" I held the screen door open, and she stepped inside, the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume mixing with the lingering smell of the apple cinnamon candle. "We need to talk, Mom," she said, not meeting my eyes as she moved into the living room. The afternoon light filtering through the sheer curtains cast a golden glow across the room, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Sarah sat down heavily on the floral print couch that Robert and I had bought 15 years ago, the same couch where we had watched countless movies together, or I had held her boys when they were babies, or Robert had taken his afternoon naps during his final months. I settled into my favorite armchair, the burgundy recliner that had molded itself to the shape of my body over the years. The leather was cracked in places, and one of the armrests was slightly loose, but it was comfortable in the way that only old, well-loved furniture could be. Sarah placed the manila envelope on the coffee table between us, her fingers drumming nervously against her knee. What is it, dear? I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. There was something in her posture, something in the way she avoided my gaze, that reminded me of the phone call I had received 3 years ago telling me that Robert had collapsed at the grocery store. Sarah took a deep breath, the sound loud in the quiet room where only the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing seconds. Mom, I found something when I was cleaning out Dad's old desk in the garage last weekend. Something important that I think you need to see. The desk she was referring to was an old oak piece that Robert had inherited from his father. It had been sitting in the garage for the past 3 years, covered with a paint-stained tarp and surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations and gardening tools. I had been meaning to go through it, to sort through Robert's papers and personal effects, but the task had felt too overwhelming, too final. It was easier to leave it untouched, to pretend that part of him was still there, waiting. What kind of something? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The house seemed to grow quieter around us, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper. The documents looked official, with embossed seals and formal letterhead that caught the afternoon light. She spread them out on the coffee table, arranging them carefully as if they were pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. It is Dad's will, Mom. His real will. The one we never saw. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. Robert and I had always been open about our finances, our plans, our future. We had talked about wills and estates, about what would happen when one of us was gone. He had assured me that everything was taken care of, that I would be secure, that the house would be mine. But we had never actually seen any formal documents. Robert had handled all the legal affairs, just as he had handled the taxes and the insurance and all the other paperwork that seemed to multiply with age. I do not understand, I said, reaching for the papers with trembling hands. The documents felt substantial, important, the kind of papers that carried weight beyond their physical presence. The text was dense and full of legal terminology that made my head spin, but certain phrases jumped out at me like neon signs in the darkness. Sarah leaned forward, her voice taking on a gentle but urgent tone that reminded me of how she used to explain things to her boys when they were younger. Mom, according to this will, Dad left everything to David and me. The house, his pension, his life insurance, his savings accounts. Everything. You are not mentioned as a beneficiary anywhere in these documents. The room began to spin around me, and I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. This could not be right. Robert would never have done this to me. We had been married for 45 years. We had built this life together, paid for this house together, planned our retirement together. The idea that he would leave me with nothing was so foreign, so impossible, that my mind rejected it completely. There must be some mistake, I whispered, staring at the papers without really seeing them. The words blurred together, becoming meaningless symbols on a page. This cannot be right. Your father would never. He would never do this to me. Sarah reached across the coffee table and took my hand, her fingers warm against my cold skin. I know this is shocking, Mom. I was shocked too when I found these papers. But look here, she said, pointing to a section of the document. This is his signature, and it is dated just 2 months before he died. It has been notarized and witnessed properly. This is a legal document. I stared at the signature, that familiar scrawl that I had seen on thousands of birthday cards and anniversary notes over the years. It looked like Robert's handwriting, but somehow it also looked foreign, as if it belonged to a stranger. The date stamped beside it felt like a betrayal, a secret kept in the final months of his life when I had been caring for him, driving him to doctor's appointments, holding his hand through sleepless nights. But why? I asked, my voice breaking. Why would he do this? We never had problems with money. We always talked about everything. Why would he leave me out of his will? Sarah squeezed my hand tighter, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. I do not know, Mom. Maybe he was sick, maybe his judgment was impaired by the medication he was taking. Maybe someone influenced him. I honestly do not know. But what I do know is that this house legally belongs to David and me now. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I felt something inside me begin to crumble. This house, these walls that had sheltered our family for over 3 decades, these rooms where I had raised my children and cared for my husband, where I had planned to live out the remainder of my days, was no longer mine. I was a tenant in my own home, a guest in the place where I had expected to die. What does this mean? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Sarah released my hand and sat back, her expression becoming more businesslike, more distant. The warmth that had been in her eyes moments before seemed to fade, replaced by something harder, more calculating. Well, Mom, David and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if we sold the house. The real estate market is really strong right now, and we could get a good price for it. With the money from the sale, plus Dad's other assets, David and I could both pay off some debts and put money aside for the boys' college funds. Sold? The word felt like a foreign concept, as if she were speaking a language I did not understand. You want to sell my home? Mom, it is not your home anymore. According to Dad's will, it belongs to David and me now. And we have decided that selling is the best option for everyone. I looked around the living room, taking in all the details that had become invisible through familiarity but now seemed precious and finite. The small chip in the paint beside the doorway where Sarah had thrown a toy car when she was 7. The faded rectangle on the wall where Robert's favorite painting had hung until we moved it to the bedroom 5 years ago. The worn spot on the carpet where Robert's recliner used to sit, before we moved it closer to the television when his eyesight began to fail. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, my voice barely audible. I am 68 years old, Sarah. I have lived in this house for 32 years. This is my home. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but there was still something cold in her eyes that I had never seen before. You could move into one of those nice senior communities, Mom. They have activities and social groups, and you would not have to worry about maintenance or yard work anymore. It might be good for you to be around other people your age. Senior communities. The euphemism felt like a slap in the face. She was talking about nursing homes, about assisted living facilities where old people went to wait for death. Places that smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food, where strangers would tell me when to eat and when to sleep and when to take my medications. I am not ready for that kind of place, Sarah. I am still healthy, still independent. I take care of this house just fine on my own. Sarah stood up and began pacing the length of the living room, her footsteps muffled by the carpet that Robert and I had installed when the hardwood floors became too difficult for his arthritic knees. Her scrubs rustled with each step, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tension-filled room. Mom, you have to be realistic here. You are getting older, and this house is getting older too. The roof needs work, the furnace is ancient, the plumbing has been acting up. David and I cannot afford to maintain 2 properties, especially when this one needs so much work. I have managed the maintenance just fine, I said, my voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. I have a savings account, and Robert left me some money. I can take care of repairs. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face me, her expression becoming harder. Actually, Mom, according to the will, Dad's savings accounts belong to David and me as well. You do not have access to that money anymore. The room began to spin again, and I felt nauseated. Not only was I losing my home, but I was also losing the financial security that Robert and I had built together over decades of careful saving and planning. My social security check would cover basic expenses, but it would not be enough to rent a decent apartment, let alone buy another home. This is insane, I said, standing up on shaky legs. There has to be something wrong with these papers. Robert would never have done this to me. We need to take this to a lawyer, have it examined. Sarah's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to me. Mom, I already had a lawyer look at it. Everything is in order. The will is valid, and it has been properly executed. There is nothing to contest. The finality in her voice was crushing, but something about her quick response bothered me. How had she managed to consult with a lawyer so quickly? If she had only found these papers last weekend, when had she had time to get legal advice? Unless she had found them earlier and had been planning this conversation for some time. Which lawyer did you use? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I would like to speak with them myself. Sarah picked up the papers and slid them back into the manila envelope, her movements quick and efficient. You do not need to worry about the legal details, Mom. David and I will handle everything. We just need you to start thinking about where you want to live after we sell the house. The dismissiveness in her tone made my anger flare hotter. I have every right to understand the legal situation, Sarah. This affects my entire future, my entire life. I want to see the lawyer's opinion, and I want to get a second opinion from someone else. Sarah slung her purse over her shoulder and headed toward the front door, clearly ending the conversation whether I was ready or not. We can discuss the details later, Mom. Right now, I need to get home to make dinner for the boys. But you should start looking into senior communities in the area. I can help you visit some of them next week if you want. I followed her to the door, my mind reeling with questions and objections. Wait, Sarah. We are not finished talking about this. I need more information. I need to understand how this happened, why Robert would have done this. Sarah paused with her hand on the screen door, and for a moment, her mask slipped. I saw something in her expression that chilled me to the bone. It was not grief or confusion or even sympathy. It was calculation, cold and deliberate. Mom, Dad made his decision. Maybe he thought we would take better care of his legacy than you would. Maybe he was worried about you making poor financial decisions as you get older. I do not know his reasoning, but I know that this is what he wanted. The cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. Poor financial decisions? Robert and I had managed our finances successfully for 45 years. We had paid off our mortgage, saved for retirement, and never lived beyond our means. What poor financial decisions was she referring to? Sarah pushed open the screen door and stepped onto the porch, the autumn air rushing into the house and carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace. I will call you tomorrow, Mom. Try to get some rest, and we will figure out the next steps. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk to her car, her movements quick and purposeful. She did not look back as she started the engine and backed out of the driveway, leaving me alone with the devastating news that had just turned my world upside down. The house felt different as I closed the door and walked back to the living room. The familiar spaces that had comforted me for decades now felt like borrowed rooms, like a hotel where my checkout time was rapidly approaching. I sank back into my recliner and tried to process what had just happened. Robert's will. A document that gave everything to our children and left me with nothing. It seemed impossible, but Sarah had been so confident, so certain of the legal standing of the papers she had shown me. She had already consulted with a lawyer, already made plans for selling the house, already decided my future without my input. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. Robert had always been meticulous about important matters, and he had always included me in major decisions. The idea that he would have drafted such a significant document without even mentioning it to me seemed completely out of character. And the timing bothered me too. 2 months before his death, Robert had still been mentally sharp, still been involved in our daily financial decisions. If he had wanted to change his will, why would he not have discussed it with me? I picked up the phone from the side table and dialed David's number in Phoenix. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice carrying the distant quality of someone who was multitasking while talking. Hi, Mom. What is up? This is not Wednesday. David, I need to talk to you about something important. Sarah was just here, and she showed me some papers that she says are your father's will. There was a pause, and I could hear computer keyboard sounds in the background. Yeah, she called me about that this morning. Pretty crazy, huh? I had no idea Dad had drafted a new will. So you knew about this before she came to see me today? She called me right after she found the papers, Mom. We have been trying to figure out the best way to handle the situation. Listen, I know this is a shock, but Sarah and I think it is probably for the best. That house is getting to be too much for you to handle on your own. The casual way he discussed my future, as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a life to be respected, made my hands shake. David, this is my home. I have been taking care of it just fine.
And I cannot believe your father would have left me out of his will completely.
Mom, I know it is hard to accept, but the papers look legitimate.
Sarah had them examined by a lawyer, and everything checks out.
Maybe Dad was worried about your ability to manage a large inheritance as you get older.
Maybe he thought it would be better to let Sarah and me handle the estate.
There was that phrase again, my ability to manage money as I got older.
Where had this narrative come from?
I had been managing our household finances for decades, balancing checkbooks, paying bills, tracking expenses. Robert had always trusted my judgment with money, had often deferred to my opinion on major purchases. David, your father trusted me with financial decisions throughout our entire marriage. I find it very hard to believe that he suddenly developed concerns about my capabilities just 2 months before he died.
Look, Mom, I do not know what his thinking was. All I know is that this is the will he left, and we have to respect his wishes.
Sarah is looking into real estate agents, and we should be able to get a good price for the house if we put it on the market before winter. The matter-of-fact way he discussed selling my home made me feel like I was talking to a stranger. This was my son, the boy I had raised, the man I had supported through college and career changes and relationship problems. But the person on the other end of the phone sounded like a businessman discussing a property transaction.
I want to get my own lawyer, David. I want to have these documents examined independently.
There was another pause, longer this time.
Mom, that is going to be expensive, and it is not going to change anything. The will is valid.
We have already confirmed that. How much could it change in just a few days? I want to understand my rights in this situation.
David's voice became more businesslike, more distant.
Mom, you need to accept that this is the reality of the situation. Dad left the estate to Sarah and me, and we have decided that selling the house is the best option for everyone.
Fighting it is just going to create family drama and legal bills that nobody wants. Family drama? The phrase stung. Was wanting to understand why my husband had apparently disinherited me considered drama? Was asking questions about my future considered unreasonable?
David, I am not trying to create drama. I am trying to understand how my husband could have made such a major decision without ever mentioning it to me.
It does not make sense.
I heard him typing again, the sound of someone who was dividing their attention between multiple tasks.
Maybe he was protecting you, Mom. Maybe he knew it would be hard for you to hear that he did not think you should inherit everything.
Maybe he thought it would be easier if you found out after he was gone. The suggestion that Robert had been protecting me by deceiving me felt like another betrayal.
Protecting me from what? From knowing that he had lost faith in me? From understanding that he had decided our children deserved his assets more than his wife did? I need to go, David. Jennifer is calling me for dinner.
We can talk more about this later, but I really think you should start looking into senior living options.
Sarah can help you find some nice places in the area.
Wait, David, I am not finished. But the line was already dead. He had hung up on me, dismissing my concerns as easily as he would dismiss a telemarketer or wrong number. I sat holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, feeling more alone than I had felt since the day Robert died. The house grew quiet around me as evening approached. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, and the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm in the corner, but these familiar sounds that had once been comforting now felt hollow and temporary. Everything around me belonged to my children now, according to the will Sarah had shown me. The furniture I had chosen, the decorations I had collected over the years, the photographs on the mantelpiece that chronicled our family's history, all of it was part of an estate that no longer included me.
I walked through the house, looking at everything with new eyes.
The kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals, where Robert and I had shared our morning coffee every day for over 3 decades. The dining room where we had hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and graduation celebrations. The master bedroom where we had slept side by side, where I had held Robert's hand during his final days, where I had grieved alone for the past 3 years. All of it was scheduled to be sold, and I would be relocated to a senior community where strangers would decide my daily routine. The life I had built, the home I had created, the independence I had maintained, all of it was being taken away based on a document I had never seen, a decision I had never been consulted about. But as I walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects and remembering the stories they represented, my shock began to transform into something else.
Anger, yes, but also determination.
Something about Sarah's behavior this afternoon had felt rehearsed, too smooth, too prepared. And David's quick dismissal of my concerns had felt defensive, as if he were protecting something. I had spent 45 years married to Robert, and I knew him better than anyone. The man who had held my hand when our children were born, who had cried with me when we lost our parents, who had spent his final weeks telling me how much he loved me and how grateful he was for our life together, that man would not have left me homeless and penniless without a word of explanation. Something was wrong with this picture, and I was going to figure out what it was. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I had not felt since Robert's death. The sun was streaming through the bedroom window, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow across the hardwood floor. The house felt more like home again, less like a temporary shelter, and I realized that I was not going to give up without a fight. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the phone book, looking up attorneys in the Columbus area who specialized in estate law. The yellow pages felt heavy in my hands, a weight of possibility and hope. If Robert had truly left me out of his will, then I needed to understand why and whether anything could be done about it. But if something was wrong with the documents Sarah had shown me, then I needed to know that too. I made a list of 5 law firms and began making phone calls. The first 3 were either not taking new clients or could not see me for several weeks. The 4th firm, Henderson & Associates, had an opening that afternoon. I made the appointment and spent the morning gathering every financial document I could find, bank statements, insurance policies, investment records, anything that might help a lawyer understand our financial situation. The law office was located in a converted Victorian house downtown, with tall windows and polished wood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The receptionist, a woman about my age with silver hair and kind eyes, offered me coffee and a comfortable chair in the waiting room. The walls were lined with legal books and diplomas, giving the space a sense of authority and competence that I found reassuring. Attorney Margaret Henderson was a woman in her 50s with an efficient manner and a warm smile. She invited me into her office, which was filled with natural light from large windows that overlooked a small garden. The space felt professional but not intimidating, and she had the kind of presence that made me feel like my concerns would be taken seriously. "Mrs. Peterson," she said after I had explained the situation, "I would like to take a look at the will your daughter showed you."
Do you have a copy of it with you?
No, I admitted, feeling foolish. Sarah took the papers with her when she left. She said she would handle all the legal details. Attorney Henderson made a note on her yellow legal pad. "That is the first red flag," she said. In a legitimate estate situation, beneficiaries typically receive copies of all relevant documents.
The fact that your daughter is controlling access to the will is unusual and concerning.
She asked me a series of questions about Robert's health in his final months, his mental capacity, our financial arrangements during our marriage, and our relationship with our children. I found myself telling her things I had not articulated before, details about Robert's character and our partnership that seemed important in the context of the alleged will. "Mrs. Peterson," Attorney Henderson said when I finished, "based on what you have told me, your husband's alleged will raises several serious questions. First, it is extremely unusual for someone to completely disinherit a spouse without explanation, especially in a long-term marriage where there were no financial problems or marital difficulties.
Second, the timing is suspect. If your husband had concerns about your ability to manage finances, why would he wait until just 2 months before his death to address them?"
I felt a wave of relief wash over me.
Someone else found the situation as strange as I did. So you think something might be wrong with the will?
I think there are enough irregularities to warrant a thorough investigation. I would like to request a copy of the will from the probate court, examine the original documents, and possibly interview the witnesses who signed it.
We should also look into your husband's financial records to see if there were any unusual transactions or changes in the months before his death. The prospect of a real investigation, of someone taking my concerns seriously, gave me the first hope I had felt since Sarah's visit. How long would something like this take?
It depends on what we find, but I would estimate several weeks to a few months for a complete investigation.
In the meantime, I can file a motion to prevent any sale of the house until we resolve the questions about the will's validity.
The idea that the house sale could be stopped filled me with such relief that tears began to form in my eyes. I had been so afraid that I would come home to find a realtor sign in my front yard, that my children would move forward with their plans without giving me time to understand my situation. Attorney Henderson handed me a tissue and continued.
Mrs. Peterson, I want to be clear about something.
If the will turns out to be valid, there may not be much we can do to change the outcome. But if there are problems with the document, if it was forged, or if your husband was coerced, or if there were procedural errors in its execution, then we may be able to challenge it successfully.
I understand, I said, wiping my eyes. I just need to know the truth.
If Robert really wanted to leave everything to our children, then I need to accept that.
But if something else is going on, I need to know that too. We spent the next hour going over the details of what an investigation would entail and what it would cost.
The legal fees would be significant, but not beyond what I could manage with my savings.
Attorney Henderson explained that if we were successful in challenging the will, the costs might be recoverable from the estate.
As I drove home from the law office, I felt lighter than I had in days. Someone believed that my concerns were legitimate, and someone was willing to help me find answers.
The familiar streets of my neighborhood looked more welcoming, and the house looked more like home as I pulled into the driveway.
But my sense of relief was short-lived. Sarah's car was parked in front of the house, and she was standing on the porch with a man I did not recognize. He was tall and thin, wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a briefcase. They were both looking at the house with the appraising gaze of people evaluating property. I parked in the driveway and walked toward them, my newly found confidence wavering.
Sarah turned as I approached, and I could see irritation in her expression. Mom, where have you been? I have been trying to call you all afternoon.
I went out to run some errands, I said, not wanting to mention the lawyer until I knew more about what Attorney Henderson might find.
This is Mark Stevens, Sarah said, indicating the man in the suit.
He is a real estate agent, and he is going to help us get the house ready to sell.
Mark stepped forward and extended his hand. Mrs. Peterson, it is nice to meet you. Your daughter tells me you will be relocating soon. I think we can get a very good price for this property if we move quickly.
The casual assumption that I was ready to relocate, combined with the fact that Sarah was already bringing real estate agents to my house, made my anger flare.
I am not ready to discuss selling the house, I said.
There are still some legal questions that need to be resolved.
Sarah's expression darkened. Mom, we already talked about this.
The legal questions have been resolved. The will is valid, and David and I have decided to sell. I consulted with an attorney today, I said, watching Sarah's face carefully for her reaction. She wants to examine the will and investigate some questions about its validity.
The change in Sarah's demeanor was immediate and dramatic.
Her face flushed red, and her voice became sharp and defensive.
You did what? Mom, I told you that hiring a lawyer was unnecessary and expensive. The will has already been validated.
Mark Stevens looked uncomfortable with the family tension that was erupting around him. Perhaps I should come back another time, he said, beginning to back away from the porch.
No, Sarah said quickly. We are still moving forward with the sale. Mom is just having trouble accepting the situation. The real estate agent looked between us uncertainly, clearly not wanting to be caught in the middle of a family dispute.
Why do not I leave my card, he said diplomatically, and you can call me when you are ready to proceed. After Mark left, Sarah turned to me with an expression of fury that I had not seen since her teenage years.
Mom, what attorney did you hire? What did you tell them?
I hired Margaret Henderson, and I told her the truth about what happened yesterday.
She thinks there are some serious questions about the will that need to be investigated.
Sarah began pacing the porch, her agitation growing with each step.
This is ridiculous, Mom. You are going to waste money on legal fees, and you are going to create problems for everyone. David is furious that you are dragging this out. David is furious? When did you talk to David? I called him after I could not reach you this afternoon. We both think you are making a mistake by hiring a lawyer.
The fact that my children were discussing my decisions behind my back, coordinating their responses and strategies without including me, felt like another betrayal. But it also confirmed my growing suspicion that they were hiding something from me.
Sarah, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, if this will is legitimate, then an attorney's investigation will confirm that. If there are problems with it, then I need to know.
Either way, I have a right to understand the legal situation that affects my future.
You do not have any rights here, Mom, Sarah snapped. The house belongs to David and me now.
You are living here at our discretion, and if you keep causing problems, we might have to ask you to leave sooner rather than later. The threat was so cold, so calculating, that it took my breath away. This was my daughter, the child I had raised and loved and supported through every difficulty in her life. But the woman standing in front of me seemed like a stranger, someone motivated by greed and manipulation rather than love and concern. Sarah, I said quietly, I do not know what has happened to you, but this is not the daughter I raised. The Sarah I know would never threaten to make her mother homeless. For a moment, her mask slipped again, and I saw something that looked almost like guilt in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by defiance. Mom, you need to face reality. Dad made his decision, and David and I are going to honor it. You can waste your money on lawyers if you want, but it is not going to change anything. She walked to her car and got in, slamming the door harder than necessary. As she backed out of the driveway, she rolled down her window. I will be back tomorrow with more information about senior communities. You need to start making some decisions about where you want to live. I watched her drive away, feeling shaken by the confrontation but also more determined than ever to find out what was really going on. The Sarah who had visited me yesterday and today was not the same person who had been bringing her boys to Sunday dinner, who had called me every few days to check on me, who had seemed genuinely concerned about my welfare after Robert's death. Something had changed, and that change had coincided with her alleged discovery of Robert's will. Either the contents of that will had revealed a side of her character that I had never seen before, or something else was motivating her sudden eagerness to sell my house and relocate me to a senior facility. That evening, I called my sister Patricia in Cleveland. Patricia was 5 years older than me, and she had always been the practical one in our family. She had raised 4 children while working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, and she had a sharp eye for detecting when something was not quite right. Patricia, I said after explaining the situation, does any of this sound right to you? Does it make sense that Robert would have left me out of his will completely? Absolutely not, Patricia said without hesitation. Robert adored you, Margaret. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you two could see how devoted he was. And he was always so proud of how well you managed the household finances. The idea that he would suddenly develop concerns about your capabilities is absurd. That is what I thought, but Sarah and David seem so certain that the will is legitimate. Well, they would not they? If they stand to inherit everything, they have a strong motivation to believe the will is real, whether it actually is or not. Patricia's blunt assessment of my children's motivations was painful but probably accurate. Do you think they could be involved in something dishonest? I hate to say this about your children, Margaret, but stranger things have happened when money is involved. People can justify almost anything to themselves when they stand to benefit financially. We talked for another hour, and Patricia's support gave me the strength to continue with the investigation. She also offered to loan me money if the legal costs became too burdensome, an offer that brought tears to my eyes. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state. Sarah did not return with information about senior communities as she had threatened, but she also did not call or visit. David called once, ostensibly to check on me, but the conversation was stilted and brief. He asked if I was still planning to hire a lawyer, and when I confirmed that I was, he became distant and ended the call quickly. Attorney Henderson called on Friday to let me know that she had filed the motion to prevent the sale of the house and had requested copies of all documents related to Robert's estate from the probate court. She had also begun the process of trying to locate and interview the witnesses who had allegedly signed the will. Mrs. Peterson, she said, I have some preliminary information that you should know about. The will that your daughter showed you was apparently filed with the probate court just 3 weeks ago, even though it is dated several months ago. What does that mean? It means that either your daughter waited several months to file the will after finding it, which would be unusual, or the will was created more recently than its dated indicates. Either scenario raises questions about the document's authenticity. The possibility that the will had been forged sent a chill through me. Could my own children have created a fake document to steal my inheritance? The idea seemed so monstrous that I could barely entertain it, but the evidence was beginning to point in that direction. There is something else, Attorney Henderson continued. I was able to speak with one of the witnesses listed on the will. Her name is Janet Morrison, and she works as a secretary at the law firm that allegedly prepared the document. But here is the interesting part. Janet Morrison says she has never seen this will before and definitely did not witness your husband's signature. My heart began to race. So the witness signature is fake? It appears to be. I am still trying to locate the second witness, but if his signature is also fraudulent, then we have strong evidence that this will is a forgery. The word forgery hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt sick thinking about what it meant. If the will was forged, then my children had not just hidden Robert's real intentions from me, they had actively conspired to steal my inheritance and my home. Attorney Henderson arranged to meet with me the following Monday to go over the evidence she had gathered and discuss our next steps. The weekend stretched ahead of me like an eternity, filled with questions and fears and a growing sense of betrayal that cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced. On Saturday morning, I was in the garden pulling weeds when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. I looked up to see David walking toward me, his face grim with determination. He had flown in from Phoenix without telling me he was coming, which meant this was not a social visit. "Hello, Mom," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "We need to talk." I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after an hour of kneeling in the dirt. The morning sun was bright, and I had to squint to see his expression clearly. "What brings you to Columbus, David?" "Sarah called me about the lawyer situation. She told me you are trying to challenge Dad's will." "The lawyer situation." The phrase made it sound like I was causing trouble rather than trying to understand the truth about my husband's final wishes. "I am trying to find out if the will is legitimate, David. And based on what my attorney has discovered so far, there are serious questions about its authenticity." David's jaw tightened, and I could see a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Mom, you are making a big mistake. Sarah and I are trying to honor Dad's wishes and take care of his estate responsibly. Your lawyer is just trying to create billable hours by convincing you that there are problems where none exist. David, one of the witnesses listed on the will says she never witnessed your father's signature. That is not a billing issue, that is potential fraud." For a moment, David looked genuinely shocked, as if this news was unexpected. Then his expression hardened again. "That is impossible. The will was prepared by a legitimate law firm and properly witnessed." "Which law firm?" I asked. "I would like to speak with the attorney who prepared it." David hesitated, and I could see him trying to formulate an answer. "The lawyer who prepared it is retired now. That is why we did not go through him when we found the will." "What is his name?" "Even if he is retired, I should be able to contact him." "Mom, this is getting ridiculous. You are grasping at straws, trying to find problems that do not exist." The evasiveness in his responses confirmed my growing suspicions. If this will was legitimate, David should be able to answer simple questions about its preparation. The fact that he was deflecting and avoiding specifics suggested that he knew more about the document's problems than he was admitting. "David," I said, looking directly into his eyes, "did you and Sarah create a fake will?" The question hung between us like a challenge, and I watched his face carefully for his reaction. For just a moment, I saw something that looked like panic in his expression. Then he became angry. "How can you even ask me something like that? How can you accuse your own children of forgery? We are trying to carry out Dad's wishes, and you are accusing us of being criminals." "I am asking because the evidence suggests that the will is not legitimate, and you and Sarah are the only ones who benefit from it." David turned away from me and stared at the house, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but filled with something that sounded like desperation. "Mom, Sarah, and I have debts. Serious debts that are putting our families at risk.
Sarah's boys need dental work that insurance will not cover, and Marcus's business is failing. My company is downsizing, and I might lose my job. We need the money from Dad's estate to keep our families afloat.
The admission was like a confession, and I felt my heart break for my children even as I realized they had betrayed me. They were not greedy monsters, they were desperate people who had convinced themselves that stealing from their mother was justified by their circumstances.
David, I said gently, if you and Sarah are having financial problems, we could have worked something out. I would have helped you. But creating a fake will is not the answer.
He turned back to me, and I could see tears in his eyes.
It was not supposed to hurt you, Mom. We thought we could sell the house and give you enough money to get a nice apartment somewhere. We thought you would be better off not having to worry about maintenance and property taxes. But I do not want to sell the house, David. This is my home.
And taking away my inheritance without my knowledge or consent is theft, no matter how you justify it to yourself. David sat down heavily on the porch steps, his shoulders sagging with defeat.
Sarah said it would be easy.
She said we would just file the will and handle everything quickly, before you had time to ask questions.
She said you would accept the situation and move on. So Sarah was the one who came up with this plan?
She found some templates online for writing wills. She said she could make it look official, and nobody would question it because you would not know what to look for. The casual way Sarah had researched and planned the forgery made it seem even more calculating and cruel. This was not a desperate act committed in a moment of panic, this was a premeditated crime designed to steal my life savings and my home.
David, I need to know everything. How did Sarah create the will? Who helped her? How long have you been planning this? Over the next hour, David told me the whole story.
Sarah had been researching online will templates for months, ever since Marcus's business had started failing and their bills had begun to pile up. She had created multiple drafts of the fake will, trying to make it look as professional as possible.
She had practiced forging Robert's signature until she could replicate it convincingly.
She had even researched the names of real law firms and notaries to make the documents seem more authentic. The witness signatures were completely fake. Sarah had made up the names and addresses, hoping that no one would try to verify them. The notary seal was created using a kit she had ordered online, and she had backdated the document to make it seem like Robert had drafted it before his death.
But why did you go along with it? I asked. You knew it was wrong.
David looked ashamed, but also defiant. Because I need the money, Mom. Emma is starting to look at colleges, and I do not have anything saved for her tuition. The house in Phoenix is underwater on the mortgage, and we are barely making the payments. When Sarah showed me how much we could get for this house, it seemed like the answer to all our problems.
And what about me? What about my problems? We thought you would be fine.
Your Social Security covers your basic expenses, and we were going to give you some money from the sale to help with the transition.
Some money. From the sale of my own house, using forged documents that disinherited me.
The generosity was overwhelming.
David, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, do you realize that what you and Sarah have done is not just unethical, it is illegal? Forging legal documents is a felony. You could go to prison.
His face went white, and I could see that he had not fully considered the legal consequences of their scheme.
Sarah said nobody would find out if we handled it right.
She said estate disputes happen all the time, and nobody investigates them very carefully. Well, somebody is investigating this one, and they have already found evidence that the will is forged. David, you and Sarah need to withdraw the fake will from probate court immediately, before this goes any further. David stood up and began pacing the length of the porch, much the way Sarah had done a few days earlier. I could see him trying to calculate his options, trying to find a way out of the situation that would not destroy his family.
If we withdraw the will, we do not get anything from Dad's estate, he said. We will lose our houses, David. Emma will not be able to go to college. If you do not withdraw the will, you could go to prison, and your families will be even worse off.
David, you have to stop this before it gets any worse. But even as I said the words, I realized that it was probably already too late. The fake will had been filed with the probate court, My attorney was conducting an investigation, and evidence of forgery was mounting. Even if David and Sarah withdrew the document now, there would likely be legal consequences for what they had already done.
David seemed to reach the same conclusion.
He stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression of despair that reminded me of how he had looked as a child when he had broken something valuable and knew he was going to be in serious trouble.
"What are we going to do, Mom?"
The question broke my heart, because despite everything they had done to me, these were still my children. They had made terrible decisions motivated by desperation and greed, but they were still the babies I had raised, the young adults I had supported through college, the parents I had watched struggle to provide for their own families. "David," I said, "I think you and Sarah need to get your own lawyers and prepare to face the consequences of what you have done. And I think you need to tell your families the truth about what has happened, because they are going to find out anyway." The conversation ended with David leaving to return to his hotel, promising to call Sarah and convince her to meet with me the next day. I spent the evening thinking about the complete collapse of my family, the betrayal by the children I had loved and trusted, and the uncertain future that lay ahead of me. But I also felt a strange sense of relief. The questions that had been nagging at me since Sarah's first visit had been answered. My instincts about Robert's character had been correct. He would never have left me homeless and penniless without explanation. The will was fake, my children had conspired against me, and the truth was finally coming to light.
On Sunday afternoon, Sarah arrived at the house looking haggard and defeated.
She had clearly been crying, and her usually perfect appearance was disheveled. David had called her after our conversation, and she knew that their scheme had been exposed. "Mom," she said as soon as I opened the door, "I am so sorry.
I never meant for things to go this far."
We sat in the living room where this nightmare had begun just a week earlier, but now the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of Sarah's confident presentation of legal documents, we had a daughter confessing to her mother about a crime that could destroy both our lives.
"Sarah," I said, "I need you to explain to me how you could have done this. How could you have forged your father's will and tried to steal my home?"
Tears began flowing down her cheeks as she struggled to find words. "Marcus lost 3 big contracts last month, and we are behind on our mortgage payments. The boys need so much, school supplies, clothes, activities, and I have been working extra hours just to keep us afloat. When I was cleaning out Dad's desk and saw all the financial records, all the money that was just sitting there while we were struggling, I started thinking that maybe there was a way to access some of it."
"But you knew that money belonged to me after your father died. You knew that I would need it for my own security."
Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue, smearing her mascara and making her look younger and more vulnerable.
"I know it was wrong, Mom, but I was desperate.
I started researching online about how wills work, and I found out how much this house is worth in today's market. It seemed like there was enough money to take care of everyone, you would have enough to live comfortably in a nice apartment, and David and I would have enough to solve our financial problems. So you decided to forge a will that would give you legal access to assets that did not belong to you." "I did not think of it as stealing," Sarah said, her voice becoming defensive again. "I thought of it as redistributing Dad's assets in a way that would help the most people. You do not need a 3-bedroom house, Mom. You could be just as happy in a smaller place." The paternalistic reasoning behind her crime, that she knew better than I did what I needed, was almost as infuriating as the theft itself. "Sarah, that was not your decision to make. Those were not your assets to redistribute. And creating a forged legal document is not redistribution, it is fraud." Sarah broke down completely, sobbing so hard that she could barely speak.
"I know, Mom. I know it was wrong, and I know I have ruined everything. But I do not know how to fix it now. David says we could go to prison, and if that happens, what will happen to our children?"
The mention of her boys, my grandsons, made my own eyes fill with tears. Jake and Tommy had no part in their parents' crimes, but they would suffer the consequences if Sarah and Marcus were prosecuted and imprisoned.
"Sarah," I said gently, "you should have come to me when you were having financial problems. We could have worked something out. I would have helped you."
"I was too ashamed," she admitted. "I did not want you to know that we were failing financially. Marcus has so much pride about his business, and I have been trying to protect him from having to admit that we need help."
The irony was devastating.
Sarah had been too proud to ask for help,
so instead she had committed a felony that might destroy her family anyway. Pride had led to desperation, desperation had led to crime, and crime was leading to consequences far worse than the original financial problems. What happens now? Sarah asked, looking at me with the same expression she had worn as a child when she had made a serious mistake and was hoping I could fix it. Now you and David need to get lawyers immediately, and you need to withdraw the fake will from probate court. You need to prepare your families for the possibility that there will be criminal charges, and you need to start thinking about how to make restitution for what you have tried to take. Restitution? But we have not actually taken anything yet. Sarah, you filed a forged legal document with the court system. You attempted to steal my inheritance and my home. Even if you do not ultimately succeed, the attempt itself is a crime. The next few hours were spent in difficult conversations about practical matters. Sarah called Marcus and told him the truth about the fake will, a conversation that I could hear from the next room as he shouted about her stupidity and recklessness. David called Jennifer and had a similar conversation, though Jennifer's reaction seemed more focused on the potential legal consequences than on the moral implications. Both families would need to hire criminal defense attorneys immediately, which would be expensive and would add to the financial pressures that had motivated the original crime. The irony was not lost on me. In trying to solve their money problems by stealing from me, my children had created much bigger money problems for themselves. Attorney Henderson called me on Monday morning to report that she had confirmed the forgery of both witness signatures and had found several other irregularities in the document that proved it was fake. She had also spoken with officials at the law firm whose letterhead had been used, and they had no record of ever preparing a will for Robert Peterson. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, "we have more than enough evidence to prove that the will is fraudulent. The question now is whether you want to pursue criminal charges against your children or try to handle this as a civil matter." The decision about whether to have my own children arrested and prosecuted was perhaps the most difficult choice I had ever faced. On one hand, they had committed serious crimes against me and had shown no remorse until they were caught. On the other hand, they were still my children, and their families would suffer if they went to prison. "Can you give me some time to think about it?" I asked. "I need to talk to Sarah and David about their options." "Of course. But I should warn you that even if you choose not to file charges, the probate court may refer this matter to law enforcement anyway. Forging legal documents is taken very seriously by the court system." That evening, I called both of my children and asked them to come to the house for a family meeting. It was the first time the three of us had been in the same room since Robert's funeral, and the atmosphere was heavy with tension and unspoken recriminations. "I have been thinking about our situation," I began, "and I want to propose a way forward that might help all of us. But it will require complete honesty and cooperation from both of you." David and Sarah exchanged glances, and I could see hope beginning to form in their expressions. "First, you will immediately withdraw the fake will from probate court and admit that it was fraudulent. Second, you will both get counseling to help you understand how you could have made such terrible decisions. Third, you will work with me to create a legitimate plan for helping with your financial problems that does not involve stealing from me." "What kind of plan?" Sarah asked cautiously. "I own this house free and clear, and it is worth a substantial amount of money. If you are willing to be honest about your financial situations and work with me to find solutions, we might be able to arrange some kind of loan or assistance that helps you without destroying my security." David leaned forward, his expression intense. "You mean you might sell the house anyway and share the proceeds?" "I mean I might consider a home equity loan or some other financial arrangement that gives you access to money you need without forcing me to give up my home. But this would only be possible if you prove to me that you can be trusted, which means facing the consequences of what you have already done." The conversations that followed were painful but necessary. Sarah and David had to confront the full extent of their financial problems, their poor decision-making, and the impact their crimes had had on our family. They had to acknowledge that their desperation did not justify their actions, and that they had violated the trust that forms the foundation of any family relationship. It took several weeks to work out the details, but eventually we reached an agreement. Sarah and David withdrew the fake will from probate court and admitted to the forgery, but because they had not actually succeeded in stealing anything, and because I was willing to work with the prosecutor's office to arrange restitution,
they were able to plead to reduced charges that did not include prison time. I arranged home equity loans that provided both families with enough money to address their immediate financial crises, but the loans came with strict conditions about how the money could be used and requirements for financial counseling to help them manage their resources more effectively. The legal fees and other costs associated with resolving the situation were substantial, and the emotional cost was even higher. The trust that had once existed between me and my children was permanently damaged, and our relationship would never be the same. But I was able to keep my home, my independence, and my financial security. The house that had been threatened with sale was still mine, and I was still living the life that Robert and I had planned for my retirement years. Most importantly, I had learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I had given myself credit for. When faced with a crisis that threatened everything I valued, I had found the courage to fight back and the wisdom to seek help when I needed it. The fake will that had seemed so official and intimidating turned out to be nothing more than an elaborate lie created by desperate people who had lost their way. But the truth about Robert's real intentions, about my rights as his widow, and about my own capabilities had ultimately prevailed. The notary had indeed provided undeniable proof that the will was fake, that my children had tried to deceive me, and that sometimes the people we trust most are capable of betraying us in ways we never imagined possible. But the story also proved something else, that with determination, professional help, and a commitment to finding the truth, it is possible to overcome even the most devastating betrayals and rebuild a life worth living.